everyone, and welcome to our Week 3 summary. This week, we're going to be doing our second week on institutions, and we're going to be looking at the executive branch. So this week, we want to ask ourselves, how does the institutional structure of the executive branch affect how laws are made and affect how laws are enforced? How then, in turn, does this affect environmental policy and environmental politics? How much power does the president really have in general and on environmental policy? And what is the bureaucracy? What role do they play in environmental politics? So our first reading is going to talk about the institutional structure of the executive branch. Specifically, it highlights three key parts to the executive branch: the president, the executive office of the president, and the bureaucracy. So this reading then elaborates on what power each of these parts of the institution of the executive branch actually holds, and how that relates to their ability to influence environmental politics. Now, specifically, this reading talks quite a bit about the powers of the president and how strong these are, and how the president really does have a lot of power over environmental politics. And that is true, but the reading notes, there are limits. These limits are oftentimes completely out of the president's control. For example, one of the limits it mentions is that the president can't control who has power in Congress. And when the opposing party controls at least one chamber of Congress, it makes it harder for the president to get anything done, because the president is going to have trouble getting Congress to pass laws. Now, it also notes that, like Congress, the president often ends up reacting to environmental crises rather than being proactive. So that can limit his power to an extent as well. We are going to see, though, that the powers of the president maybe aren't quite as big as this reading indicates. So hang on to that thought for a second, and let's turn very quickly to the other two parts of the executive branch: the executive office of the president and the bureaucracy. The executive office of the president is the administrative apparatus behind the president. So these are both the president's staff, people he appoints, and civil servants who work within the White House, no matter what administration's currently in power. And these people oftentimes help advise and inform the president on various policy issues, including, of course, the environment. The bureaucracy, on the other hand, actually executes the laws. So we say that the executive branch executes the laws, but the president isn't going to a coal-fired power plant and checking to make sure that they're within EPA emissions regulations, right? President's got other things to do other than check and make sure that the chemical factory on the river isn't polluting the river. So the bureaucracy does that. The bureaucracy enforces these laws and regulations that come along with the laws. So the bureaucracy has a lot of power over that. And as we saw last week when we looked at Congress and said that Congress often doesn't issue a lot of guidance when they write laws, that means the bureaucracy has a lot of power to figure out how they want to enforce the laws, to interpret them, because there's no guidance on how to interpret them. So we'll see this week that the bureaucracy, which is made up of, for the most part, unelected civil servants and then occasionally unelected political appointees, that's sort of at the top, right? So we have the cabinet level and equivalent officials who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And then we have pretty much everyone under them who get these jobs based on merit and keep them based on merit. It's a merit-based civil service system that we have in the federal government right now. So this bureaucracy actually really does a lot of the enforcing of the laws. So even though we think about Congress, elected officials making the laws, and the president, an elected official enforcing them, the enforcement is actually done by unelected officials who have an awful lot of power to really interpret what the laws actually say. Now, returning to our discussion of the president and his powers, we have a reading titled Great Expectations, which basically says that as much power as the president has, we expect that he has more. We expect that the president can do more than the president can do. So we basically have this gap between public expectations and the president's powers. And what's really difficult for the president is if the president gets more power, it doesn't help him close that gap, because then we think, hey, he has more power, and we raise our expectations further. So it makes it potentially really hard for the president to actually do anything in environmental politics, because we expect that he's going to do more than he can do. So then we're disappointed when he only does what he does. Now, we saw a bit of that last week when we looked at the example of Congress and environmental lawmaking, and the article mentioned that Obama ended up pursuing healthcare rather than environmental policy because he really had to pick priorities. That's because the president's power is somewhat more limited than we often think. So that's what that Great Expectations article gets into. We also have a video titled Executive Orders, which discusses one of the powers that the president does have. It's a pretty big power. Basically says the president can kind of make laws all by himself. Except executive orders have two key differences from laws that are passed by Congress. One of those differences is that executive orders are impermanent. The president can issue an executive order, so a president can rescind an executive order. That means that when President Trump came in, he rescinded a lot of Obama's executive orders. But then when President Biden came in, he rescinded a lot of President Trump's executive orders, and so on and so forth. And this will keep going every time the White House switches party control. So that is all focused on domestic politics. But the president has a lot of power in international affairs as well. The president, after all, was created to be, in part, a figurehead for the U.S. in terms of international relations. So that has given the president a lot of power over this field. And obviously the environment is global, not just the U.S. only. So that can make a big difference and allow the president a lot of power over environmental politics and environmental policy. But the president still has to deal with Congress. And if Congress won't cooperate, the president can do sort of like executive orders for domestic politics, can issue executive agreements. But just like those executive orders in domestic politics, executive agreements, which govern international affairs, are not permanent. And we can see that presidents can reverse each other. And that is exactly what happened in the two articles that I give you to read this week, examining a specific case of that. Obama's signature on the executive agreement that entered the U.S. into the Paris agreements, then President Trump's reversal of that, then President Biden's reversal of President Trump's reversal. So you have those readings this week that give you a good case study of how executive agreements lack permanence. And start to think about how that's going to affect international relations and environmental politics on a global scale. We'll return to that when we look at climate change later this semester. Now, moving on from the presidency, we also look at the bureaucracy. Specifically, we're going to look at the EPA, which is one of the key bureaucratic agencies involved in environmental politics. There's an explainer from their website on what they do. You'll also notice at the bottom of that explainer, there's a little section on what they don't do. And that's really important. One of the points in that initial background reading that I give you is that the bureaucracy is fragmented. There's many different bureaucratic agencies, and a lot of laws are not enforced by just a single agency, but by many. And we can see here on the EPA's website that while there's a lot of things about the environment that we think they would do, it turns out that that's under the jurisdiction of other bureaucratic agencies. Finally, we do have one more case looking at Trump's deregulation of certain environmental regulations. And because many of those affect how the EPA implements laws, I have that at the end so that we sort of have all that information we need to understand the case. Now, there are several optional videos as usual this week, videos and readings. There's a couple sections of a textbook on the presidency and an outline from a textbook on the bureaucracy, as well as a short video that can give you some useful background.